Good morning and good evening to everyone who has joined us online. On behalf of Henley Partners, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our 14th Annual Global Citizenship Conference. My name is Hugh Morshead, and I am the Head of Government Advisory at Henley Partners, the world's leading residence and citizenship planning firm. Following the highly successful 13th Global Citizenship Conference, held at the Rosewood Hotel in London last year, Henley Partners is excited to be hosting our first ever virtual Global Citizenship Conference, with the intention of reaching an even wider audience from across the world. In view of the unprecedented events that have transpired this year, our annual event, which is the world's largest and most significant conference on investment migration, will be entirely virtual. While the viewing format has changed, you can still expect an impressive program featuring industry leaders, top-tier international service providers, and senior government officials who will explore pertinent topics and share information on the latest updates in residence and citizenship planning. This is the opening session of our 14th Global Citizenship Conference, and we will look at the future of human migration and mobility and how the coronavirus has upended the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has imposed the strictest lockdown in history, completely freezing international migration and global mobility for an extended period. And yet, all the forces that compel people to uproot themselves and move seem to be accelerating. To discuss these pertinent and complex issues, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Kaelin, the chairman of Henley Partners and one of the world's foremost experts in investment migration. Dr. Kaelin holds master's and PhD degrees in law from the University of Zurich and advises governments and international organizations. He is a sought-after speaker and author of many publications. Welcome, Chris.
Welcome.
Dr. Kaelin is joined by another leading global thinker and a member of Henley Partners Advisory Board, Dr. Parag Khanna.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and bachelor's and master's degrees from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has traveled to nearly 150 countries and is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Welcome, Parag. Dr. Khanna, perhaps I could ask you to commence today's opening session by giving us an exclusive preview into the thinking behind your forthcoming book entitled Move, Humanity's New Geography, due to be published next year.
Thank you so much, Hugh. It's such a pleasure to join you and Chris, and a pity that we couldn't be together in person, but we will make the most of it. I'm honored to be able to address all of you and to join in this conversation with you and Chris, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak or to give a preview of my book, Move. What I've tried to do is to systematically look historically and to the future at the main drivers of human migration. What have they been? During what time periods were certain drivers more important than others? And if we were to forecast 10, 20, and 30 years into the future, what can we say? What scenarios can we build? What predictions can we make with confidence about the distribution of the human species in the years 2030, 2040, and 2050? In other words, how did we get to where we are going? Why did we go there? In other words, what is the human geography of the future? And Hugh, I don't think that we can be talking about anything more important than that. And I think, again, Henley is to be commended for playing a role, important roles in how that process does actually wind up playing out. Now, let me be more specific about some of the drivers. We are in the midst, as you mentioned, this unprecedented lockdown, the likes of which we have never seen in human history. It may seem like the most ironic possible moment to be talking about the flow of people around the world, and yet it does happen anyway. And I believe that when once there is a vaccine and once there is a resumption of mobility, there'll be different patterns, there'll be different protocols, different regulations, different technologies that enable or prevent people from moving. But let me talk about the fundamental motivations that we have as humans over time to move. One of the most prominent is going back to the last 75 years, and it is simply labor shortages and demographic imbalances. Think, of course, of the populations from Turkey and other countries, as well as colonized former colonies into Europe, for example, in the post-war decades, South Asians and East Asians into the United States. That's one example. That accounts to a large degree for why we have had, up until recently, about 275 million people living outside their country of origin. Then you have political crises and upheaval. Think, of course, of just the Arab Spring of the last decade and the mass migration flows coming out of the Middle East region as just one example. Civil wars and so forth also fall into this category. Then you have, on top of demographic imbalances, political upheaval, you of course have economic disruptions. And that includes technological disruptions as well. So everything from financial crises to labor automation displaces people from wherever they have been. So think about the movement of people from Southern Europe to Northern Europe since the financial crisis a decade ago. Think about people in America leaving the Rust Belt to go elsewhere. Think about the migrations from Latin America into North America, and so on. Then, of course, there is climate change. And these days, we're speaking about the future of human migration as if climate change is the only factor. But indeed, to put it in the correct historical context, it's only the newest or most recent driver. The United Nations says that there are more climate refugees in the world today than political refugees, and those numbers could increase. And lastly, you have factors like the pandemic, where many people are saying that they have found themselves in red zones and they want to move to green zones, so to speak. In other words, those places with a higher quality of healthcare. You have to, unfortunately, we cannot view each of these factors or drivers in isolation. Many of them coexist and reinforce each other, and they again motivate people to want to move and relocate. It is my prediction, Hugh, as I discuss in more detail in the book, that the decimal place on the number of people who will be leaving their country of origin or current habitation is going to shift in the decades ahead, potentially even within just the coming decade, based, if not on all of the pre-existing factors and drivers, but most certainly because of climate change as well, from just hundreds of millions to potentially 1 billion or more people. And the question that I've sought to ask and answer is, where are they coming from? Where are they going? Which countries are going to recognize and take advantage of either the moral obligation, the economic opportunity, the political necessity? And all of these factors do really tie together and unfold simultaneously in a very complex picture. One of the conclusions I draw in the book is that movement in the future is not really going to be a matter of a one-time move in one direction from one place to another place. In fact, given the complexity and the unpredictability of many of these drivers and forces that are beyond our control, many people will find themselves moving, not just on the move, but moving multiple times for different reasons at different stages in their lives. And that's something that I get into as well. So I hope that sets the stage for a deeper, more specific conversation about how this impacts on the kinds of policies that Henley Partners works on recommending and advises governments to implement. I should mention that Henley has a fairly positive cameo in this book, given the influence that Chris, as an individual and the organization's thinking has had on me in most recent years. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parag. Chris, may I invite you to continue?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's very interesting what you say, Parag, that, basically you're looking at the whole migration ahead of us in the next few decades. And I completely agree with you. There are significant challenges ahead. Most of these challenges, however, are on a very broad basis. Like you mentioned, the climate change effects will lead to a lot more climate-related migration and refugees than even that we currently have, just from war and other reasons why people are displaced. So on the humanitarian side, we're facing really, really huge challenges, which I don't actually know how the world is going to cope with, because there's whole areas in the world that are going to be threatened by rising sea levels, where people have to move, islands that disappear, and just a lot of tragedy that is going to unfold around the world. So on a humanitarian level, that will drive migration and has always driven migration significantly, we're going to see a very, very massive increase of problems, basically. Now, that's something we also are involved with on the humanitarian side of our organization. But I would like to just focus a little bit with the limited time we have on what we do at Henley Partners on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, those people who have the choice to move. So that's, of course, a different thing. If you have the possibility to choose where you live and where you do your business and where maybe your children go to school, that's a very, very privileged situation to have. And we have in recent decades seen a tremendous increase of that kind of people that have this possibility. And we have also seen, I would say, much more open way of countries welcoming those people. Of course, very, very wealthy people have always been very international and have always had that access. But the real boom in recent years of countries opening to investors, so specifically providing legislation and incentives and programs to attract people that invest in their countries, is unprecedented as well. So this is really remarkable. And of course, we are in the midst of that. And of course, most of these drivers have been so far questions of overall life planning. Like I mentioned, children's future, for instance. If, for instance, you are today in South Africa, you may love your country, you'd like to be there, you continue to live there, but you're not so sure about the political future, and you might want your kids to grow up, or at least to study in the UK or in Australia or maybe in Singapore, but maybe not anymore in South Africa. Besides that, your South African passport is rather difficult to travel on, so you need a visa everywhere you go. You might get that visa, but already if you want to maybe travel with your niece and your grandmother or your mother-in-law or something else where it's a bit more complicated, it's very difficult. You don't even get the visa that you may need to go on a trip as a family. And that's something else that people have been driven by, the mobility, to increase their mobility based on basically their passport or access rights they have based on maybe the residence permits they hold. So for instance, the European Union Schengen residence permit gives you like permanent access to the European Union Schengen area. And so a South African family, let's say with a holiday home in Portugal, may enjoy constant access to the EU, which is both an important aspect for mobility, but also as a plan B, should something happen in their home country, they have somewhere to go. And this has been the main narrative, besides personal security, for a number of people, like Americans, for instance, that travel around the world. In some parts of the world, it's much better not to travel as an American on an American passport, but to be citizen of a small, unimportant country. It's much safer. So there are these and many other aspects that have been driving that, but these are the main ones. Now with this pandemic, what happened is rather special and really unprecedented as well, because you have seen really the European Schengen system collapse completely, in that every national government has implemented their own rules and restrictions, closed their borders. In most cases, only nationals of the countries concerned could travel back to their countries. Is same around the world, or only for permanent residents could return, things like that. It's unbelievable. So, you know, a week before some measures, you could travel freely in Europe or also elsewhere. A week later, you couldn't. And suddenly things have changed completely, so that, for instance, a Spanish passport holder in Spain could not go anywhere anymore. But if you were non-Spanish and you had a passport from outside Europe, you could still travel out of Spain and go somewhere else. So things have changed completely upside down. So the word upended in the title of this talk is rather appropriate. So things have really turned upside down. And what we have observed, of course, is that on one hand, our business has been severely affected because governments closed also their immigration offices, they closed borders, they had internal lockdowns, you couldn't even go to the notary and notarize your passport. So how are you going to do anything with, you know, with such restrictions? But as things opened up again, we have seen now a tremendous increase of demand and a completely new kind of interest and an area that people are now focused on, and that is health. So we have now, say, Italian families that say, you know, I've seen now how things have been handled in some parts of Italy, and we don't want to risk being here anymore. We want to have citizenship of another European country because we want to have the access, if that happens again, to go somewhere else, even if it's Cyprus or somewhere in the south where it's better handled than in the home country. And similar around the world, of course, if you look the way the different countries have handled this pandemic, there are huge differences. And the individuals that have the options, in other words, that have the possibility to think about, and from a personal and also financial point of view, maybe look at other options where to live, or at least have other options to have access to, they now do so, also under the aspect of their personal health, which is, of course, the most important factor of all. So it's a completely new dimension. And I wondered, I guess when you wrote your book, Parag, you didn't have the pandemic in mind. So I wondered if you were to now maybe write an update, a small update to the book, what you would think of that aspect, because that, I think, is now on everyone's mind in the world. Whether they can afford it or not is another question, but the health, you know, where you're stuck at the moment is a huge factor for you. You know, what's your view of that?
You know, in fact, I didn't write the book with this particular pandemic in mind, but I did look historically at pandemics and the impact they had. And that was already written in the manuscript before this pandemic. I looked at what happened with urbanization, for example, in light of the Black Death. And that's obviously a well-known story with the great tragic and far more significant than today loss of life. It led to a higher premium on wages or rising wages for laborers, for example, in cities, and improved conditions as well. So some of the obviously lessons from this pandemic will, of course, involve public health systems improving in places where they have failed. But Chris, do people have the patience to wait for that? You know, when an American can move to Europe or Canada and enjoy a lower cost of healthcare, you know, that is more effective, should they stay and wait? And of course, we have a presumption that all societies learn from great tragic mistakes, but do they learn the lessons well? Do they learn them equally? Do they learn them and execute on the lessons and improve their systems at the same speed? Of course not, they don't. So originally I focused more on blue zones, and blue zones, of course, as you know, connotes areas of longevity, places where there's a high quality of life and where people enjoy a kind of work-life balance and a diet and so forth that has allowed them to live a long time. So parts of Italy, Greece, Japan, and so forth. Now I've added to that the green zones, where you have the adequate healthcare systems, where perhaps universal vaccination is offered, and these kinds of measures. So I think that all now adds to the migration motivation if you will. And again, as soon as it is possible, whether or not one can afford to, as you say, is not necessarily the immediate consideration. It's really supply and demand. The question to be asked is also on the demand side, because right now there's a tricky question. When unemployment is so high, why should countries want to have an influx of new people, right? And that's actually where some of your work comes in. Because first of all, in a more macroeconomic sense, what people who make that argument fail to appreciate is that very often migrants and local labor forces do not compete with each other, right? They have different skill sets, occupy different rungs of the value chain, and so on. Secondly, migrants are bringing their life savings. They're making a bet on the economy, on the politics of a country. They are actually a stimulus. Immigration policy is stimulus policy. So right now, if we think about economies where housing markets have a large vacant stock, we think about the eroding tax base, we think about the large aging populations and their liabilities for their entitlement programs and so forth, all countries of the Northern Hemisphere actually need substantial new migration. And that has nothing to do really with, that really runs contradictory to our present mindset. So I think that both on the demand side and the supply side, we're going to see significant changes in the years ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that actually is very much the case, that in all these developed countries we're talking to, they actually need immigration. And politically, it is going in the opposite direction. And unfortunately, it's not distinguished between what kind of immigration. And so particularly in Europe, I think the immigration policy is a complete disaster, because if at all, I would say almost like the wrong kind of people come in, and then the politics goes in the wrong direction because of the lack of the focus. And if you look at countries like Canada that have a proactive immigration policy, it actually helps the country and helps the people that come. That makes a lot of sense. What a country like Canada does should be an example for the world. But what Europe does, it's kind of the opposite. It fights internally, it lets extremist parties fight at different corners of the political spectrum. In the meantime, you have all kinds of people coming uncontrolled. And then you have it further nurtures this political dispute, which doesn't make sense. And of course, we only deal with the very small, narrow spectrum of the high-end immigration. So investors, entrepreneurs that don't need a job. In fact, they create jobs.
Absolutely.
And then the absurd thing is that even that is attacked, and people talking about, criminals coming through the system or something, which is complete nonsense. But it's just politically opportunistic to say that. But actually, that's exactly the first kind of immigration you need, is immigration from entrepreneurs and investors that create employment and invest in the economy. That's exactly the number one thing you need before anything else. And so to all the politicians out there, that should be actually a lesson, like what very smart immigration countries like Canada are doing to actually actively recruit those investors, but also recruit the skills they need. So if they see there is a lack of chefs or nurses in the country, well, let's go and find those nurses somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And that's, you do an active policy and help people with their lives and also help the country to develop.
Canada is a very good example, an outstanding one. And it is, at this point, as a proportion of its own population, by far the most generous country in the world in terms of net inward annual migration. Last year, 2019, was the first year that more Indians were accepted into Canada as permanent migrants than into the United States. Now, remember, those who don't know, the United States has 10 times the population of Canada, but Canada took in 90,000 Indians and the US less than 60,000. So that's a sign of the times. I do see some change in Europe, Chris, and I share every single one of your very valid, criticisms of the short-term, narrow, populism in individual European countries. But at the same time, beneath the radar, when you mention specific professional classes, We're seeing, for example, a lot more Asian nurses in Europe. We're seeing a lot more Indian IT programmers in Europe as well. One of the concepts that I developed in this book is what I call the Asian European. And it's a hyphenated term. Now, the term does not exist. I have coined it. But I was mindful of this because I grew up as an Asian American, right? I was born in India. We migrated to the United States. And people like me, even as though we were American citizens, were always called Asian American. And I said, so how come there are no Asian Europeans? And as you know, Chris, I went to high school in Germany, and I was a very lonely ethnic Indian person, in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. And nowadays, when I go, especially, of course, to Berlin, to Hamburg, to Frankfurt, you
things
see
have changed. Yeah,
there actually is a whole new class of Asian Europeans that are not going back to Asia, that have settled in a country like Germany. You do see this in Milan as well, in northern Italy. And I think that is a sign of things to come, because at the perhaps subnational level, at the provincial level, cities in particular have maintained their openness and drawn in labor force need. And as you know, it is the sort of London versus Brexit phenomenon, where London has its own approach and attitude towards the need for talent, whereas the country as a whole voted in the opposite direction. And I see that happening quite a bit.
Of course, yeah, I think so too. Also, I think there is no other way than going in this direction. So regardless of what, as you said, regardless of what you hear and people say and talk in politics, there is no other way than to open further for immigration. Because if we don't do that, the only other option is to make more babies. And if we don't do that, we have to have more people.
One of the things that pandemics do, and of course this part everyone knows, is that they suppress fertility. Historically, that's temporary. But the current pandemic is striking at a point in time at which fertility had already hit such a terrifying low. And so here's something I want everyone to take away, because we're living at a very special moment in global demographic history. Generation Alpha are the children born between the years 2010 and 2025. So we're not yet at the end of the birth of Generation Alpha. Based on pre-pandemic projections, this Generation Alpha would be slightly larger than Generation Z. Generation Z, today's children, is the largest generation of birth in the history of the human species. Roughly 2 billion children today are Generation Z. Now, Generation Alpha was supposed to be a little bit larger, but guess what, Chris? In the next 5 years, I don't think a lot of children are going to be born because of the severe economic and social and health impacts of this pandemic. And it could be that in the year 2025, we will look back and say, with the exact precise data, that Generation Alpha is smaller than Generation Z. We will specifically witness in the year 2025 the beginning of this inflection point where we begin to decelerate and even decline by the year 2035, begin to decline in our total population size. And that's when, to bring it straight back to investment migration, that's when the war for talent really begins. Because in years past, decades past, generations past, societies could count on a regeneration of their population through their own indigenous fertility and through a normal rate of absorption of migrants. But without the former, and having suppressed the latter for so many years because of this populism that you and I have been talking about, there is going to be a significant need to overcompensate because of the fiscal crisis. So perhaps come 2025 or so, governments will have to screw their heads back on straight and participate vigorously in the war for talent.
I have one good takeaway for you too. That on the other side of what we see now after this pandemic is the government's needs and the government's actions, because the pandemic has also shown that basically, despite all the international cooperation and everything, as I mentioned before, Europe in particular with its Schengen system and otherwise, in the end, all decisions have been made by national governments and continue to be made completely on their own, more or less. Basically every government, every nation looks for themselves first and say, okay, what do we do here now? What do our health advisors say? And this can deviate even from European country to European country and from Asian country to Asian country, how Singapore manages its pandemic strategy is completely different than from some of its neighbors, so it is really national. And what we've seen in our investment migration practice, which of course also involves to a large part advising governments, is it's also huge demand and interest now, even more than before, from governments to say exactly that. We need now to move on this from a number of points of view. So despite of the rhetoric, what actually is happening is that now, even more than before, the trend of governments looking into investment migration and talent migration, attracting the right kind of people that bring talent and investments, has also completely changed. So there's a lot more interest in that. And so we will expect not just like before, we expected this trend to continue, but actually now accelerate thanks to this pandemic. So we will see a lot more countries now coming with citizenship programs, investment migration programs of different kinds, talent migration projects to attract more of the right kind of immigrants. So actually what will happen is more of that.
Chris and Parag, thank you both for an extremely interesting discussion about the future of human migration and mobility. The second session of our 14th Annual Global Citizenship Conference will focus on the emerging new global mobility hierarchy in the COVID era. We have invited a number of leading commentators from across the globe to consider what lies ahead for the USA in the wake of the recent presidential election, and we will also contemplate EU-UK mobility post the Brexit transition at the end of the year. Our team of experts will also examine the wider implications of restricted mobility for citizens of African countries, and also look at how Southeast Asia could provide a leading example of expanded, pandemic-driven regional cooperation. Therefore, please join us again on Thursday, the 12th of November at 9:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time for what is bound to be an enlightening session. Thank you very much.